A sincere thank you to Cindy McCain, the McCain family, and the McCain Institute for honoring me by including me in this year's Sedona Forum, Defending Democracy. It's so nice to be here, albeit virtually. So in 1778, with the British occupying New York City during the Revolutionary War, General George Washington and Major Benjamin Tallmadge created a network of spies, codename Culper, after Virginia's Culpeper County. The Culper Ring spread throughout New York City and Long Island and Connecticut. In Connecticut, Lieutenant Caleb Brewster in Norwalk provided intelligence on British warships before the Battle of Rhode Island, among other intel he provided. Brewster had commanded an armed boat patrolling the Long Island Sound. On December 7th, 1782, later, he was severely wounded by a bullet to his chest. As Brewster later wrote, quote, "With this wound, I languished and was confined 2 years and a half under distressing surgical operations and a most forlorn hope of cure, incapable of any labor that requires a considerable exertion, and have reduced me to the melancholy condition of an invalid for life," unquote. Now, Brewster wrote this down in a letter to George Washington in 1792, and he did so because he needed help. Though all the way back in 1776, the Continental Congress had pledged, in order to get recruits, had pledged that any severely wounded veterans would get half pay for life. This was the United States of America's first pension law. They left the actual payments to the states, a familiar way of passing the buck, unfunded mandates, as they call them today. And at the time, neither New York or Connecticut, states whose armies Brewster had served with, neither of them would help Brewster. Now, after the U.S. Congress formally formed in 1789, no longer just the Continental Congress, Lieutenant Brewster petitioned them, the federal government. Congress then moved to grant Brewster the money, but then the U.S. Treasury refused to pay it. This all might sound familiar to anybody who's dealt with the VA in the modern era. Now, this veteran story has a happy ending because thankfully President Washington helped his former spy. And in 1792, almost a decade after Brewster's debilitating wound, he was given the pension he deserved, the pension that he had earned. The United States of America has a long and checkered history of treating our brave veterans like this. From Brewster to General MacArthur ordering his troops to clear out the World War I veterans who had marched on Washington for their bonuses, to the VA waitlist scandal of the Obama years, our country and its leaders like to talk a big game when it comes to how we like to treat our veterans. And then we all take off outside the kitchen door before the check comes. My mom is a psychiatric nurse who worked at the VA in Philly, so I know firsthand there are a lot of really good people trying to help veterans with the struggles they have, because we, the people, elected politicians who sent them into harm's way. But my eyes were first really opened to some of the loneliness that veterans feel, the sense of being not just forgotten but discarded. When I covered my first presidential race in 1999 and 2000, and spent a great deal of that time covering the campaign of a senator and Vietnam veteran named John McCain. At stops throughout New Hampshire, I remember seeing Vietnam veterans holding signs, wearing baseball caps with their service branch, or military uniforms with their ribbons, standing proud, maybe even for the first time in some cases, proud to show their service, suggest their sacrifice, hoping to get some recognition from their fellow Vietnam veteran, a POW no less, running for president. As I recall it, during his town halls, McCain would often tell the assembled crowd to thank the veterans that we saw there, and indeed to thank any uniformed service members whenever we would encounter them in the future. I've covered a lot of politicians and a lot of remarks by a lot of politicians, but I never forgot that. That was an intense campaign. You all know the stories, I'm sure. And I have many great memories of that campaign. There were 3 of us young reporters to whom McCain took something of a shine, and we were given more access than other journalists. We were even allowed sometimes in the hotel suites when election results came in, not just positive election results. McCain had a temper, and a lot's been written and said about that. But other times, he had such a tremendous sense of calm and cool, often as bad news would come in. His 2000 campaign was not as flush with cash as some of his rivals. He didn't have as much money as he would have liked. And I recall his campaign airplane being something of a bucket of bolts. And I have another vivid memory of one time we were flying, I think west, on it, and we were going through some really bad turbulence. And the plane was ricketing and wobbling, and people were scared, as I remember. I remember being unsettled. And then I looked up and down the aisle, and there was Senator McCain. Now, by this time in the campaign, we all knew quite a bit about him and his biography and his service. We knew as a Navy flyer he'd lost 2 aircraft. One was pilot error, the other was an engine failure. He lost a 3rd aircraft on the deck of the USS Forrestal during that horrible accident caused by a different plane. A 5th plane was lost, of course, when he was, a 4th plane was lost, of course, when he was shot down over Hanoi. And then there was, of course, there was also a 5th plane that was in an accident McCain caused by, in his own words, daredevil clowning. It wasn't destroyed, but it wasn't an accident. So at this point, we knew the legend of McCain crashing 5 planes. Anyway, back to that night in spring 2000. Horrible turbulence, bucket of bolts of a plane. I look up and there's McCain standing in the aisle. Everybody else is sitting down, seatbelts on. He's standing in the aisle, just, holding a glass of vodka, trying to reassure everyone, saying something like, "They can't kill me in a plane. I can't be killed in a plane." And that might be my favorite memory of the senator. When last I saw him in person, after his diagnosis, he quoted the playwright William Saroyan. He's, quote, "Everybody has got to die, but I've always believed an exception would be made in my case," unquote. How we all wish it were so. "Live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart," McCain once wrote in one of his many books that he collaborated on with Mark Salter. And that's what I saw that night in the plane. Not that he didn't fear death, of course he did, but he lived his life as if he didn't. Quote, "Love your life, perfect your life, beautify all things in your life, seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of your people," unquote. In the service of your people. Now, many of us who covered John McCain heard him say that over and over, and during his presidential run, and throughout our time covering him on the Hill, about seeking a cause greater than our own self-interest. Now, one of my causes as a broadcaster and as a citizen, informed by covering McCain and having my eyes opened to the needs and the struggles of the veteran community in this country. One of my causes has been to try to bring more attention to the stories and the needs and the injustices surrounding the lives of our service members and our veterans and those who love them. It's a cause I fully embraced when writing the book, The Outpost, about the attack on Combat Outpost Keating in Afghanistan in October 2009. I remember after meeting with 2 of the more than 200 service members I interviewed for that book, service members and their families, these were Dave Roller and Alex Newsom of 191 CAV. 2 guys who, like me, came from somewhat privileged backgrounds, Coral Gables, Florida, and Beverly Hills, California. whose lives were about service. Now, Dave and Alex had reached out to me because they had read that I was writing a book about the battle in 2009, which was 361 Cav. They'd served at Cop Keating 2 years before with 191 Cav, and Dave and Alex wanted to make sure that I told the stories of their fallen brothers too. Major Tom Bostic and Staff Sergeant Ryan Fritchie and Private Chris Pfeiffer, because I was going to be telling the stories of the 8 men killed in 2009, but far more than 8 men died at Combat Outpost Keating in its 4 years of existence. So Alex and Dave, I went to lunch with them, and I came back from that lunch, and I said to my wife, honey, I'm such a piece of garbage. These guys have served their country. They've lost their friends. They've done so much. And relatively, I've done nothing for anyone other than myself and my family. And she said, but you can tell their stories, honey. You can tell their stories. So while I think today about the focus of this conference and what American democracy should represent here and abroad, especially in the midst of all the challenges we face from abroad and from inside the United States, I think about both of these ideas, supporting the cause of veterans and telling their stories. And that's my focused mission, and I try to do so through my work with Homes for Our Troops and by covering the stories of veterans on my shows on CNN. But more broadly, the way I look at it in terms of this conference is, if veterans represent a symbol of our citizenry, they are fellow Americans who do so much for us with so little thanks, and who often also need our help, even if it's just honoring our pledges, as with Lieutenant Brewster. That's the veteran component of it. Telling their stories is just another way of honoring their experiences, sharing the facts and the truth of those stories. In other words, this is, to me, a commitment to compassion and decency by honoring those who serve us and sacrifice for us, and a commitment to truth and to facts. And these are two imperatives that are sadly lacking in our discourse today and under assault, but in my view, two imperatives, two principles that this country cannot succeed without. In our last interview, I asked Senator McCain how he would like to be remembered. He said, quote, he served his country and not always right, made a lot of mistakes, made a lot of errors, but served his country. And I hope we could add, he said, honorably. And of course, we add honorably. Thank you for the honor of getting to speak with you today.
Hello and welcome. I'm Courtney Kube. I'm the NBC News National Security and Pentagon Correspondent. And I am so honored and thrilled to be a part of the 2021 McCain Institute Sedona Forum. And I am especially excited to be part of this next panel, moderating with retired Admiral William McRaven. Admiral McRaven spent 37 years in the United States Navy, where he served in a number of leadership positions for Special Operations community, ultimately reaching the commanding admiral of U.S. Special Operations Command in August of 2011. Prior to that assignment, of course, he was the commander of Joint Special Operations Command, where he oversaw the successful execution of an operation called Neptune Spear, which many of you will know is the one that took out Osama bin Laden. After his retirement in 2014, Admiral McRaven became the chancellor of the University of Texas Systems for about more than 3 years. And retirement continues to escape him even today, where he is now an author. He continues to teach at the LBJ School, and he speaks. Admiral McRaven, thank you so much for being here, and welcome.
Hey, Courtney, it's great to join you. Thanks.
So I want to jump into the theme of this year's forum, and it is defending democracy. One of the critical principles of democracy, of course, is the civil-military relationship, something that you know well from your time in uniform. It includes civilian control of the military, of course, with the commander-in-chief being the US president. Several times during the previous president, President Trump's time in office, you criticized him. You came out against him, including an op-ed in October 2019 entitled, "Our Republic is Under Attack from the President," where you argued that President Trump needed to demonstrate his leadership, better leadership, or be replaced. While in uniform, of course, you weren't allowed to publish something like that or speak out in this way. But many retired military officers still believe that retired generals, admirals, officers should not speak out in such a way, should not criticize their commander-in-chief. Why did you decide to speak out several times against President Trump?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Well, first, there is this kind of unwritten rule that as a retired senior officer, you don't speak out against the commander-in-chief. And I think that is a good rule. And so I've told folks, when I get criticized for speaking out, and trust me, I have been criticized, I say, look, that is fair criticism. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people saying, hey, you're a retired senior officer, you shouldn't do this. Roger, I got it. But I also think you have to wake up every morning and look yourself in the mirror and decide whether or not you think you're doing the right thing. And all of this began actually when I was the chancellor of the University of Texas System. And it started when the president said that the press was the enemy of the American people. Now, I've fought the enemy of the American people, and it's not the press. And I happened to be speaking to the School of Communications that evening, and I just could not let this comment go unaddressed. So I took the opportunity to talk to these prospective journalists, of which, by the way, I am a journalism major, so I have a particular bent for ensuring that we do things right in the world of journalism. But I told them that this sentiment by the president really was the greatest threat to democracy in my lifetime. And there were a lot of people who said, how could you say that? I mean, we had the Soviet Union, you had terrorism, I said, yeah, but all of those brought us together as a nation, brought us together as a democracy. But when the president of the United States assaults the First Amendment, and I often believe it is the First Amendment for a reason, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, we have to have this as part of the foundation of our democracy. When he said that, I said, look, I have a responsibility both as the chancellor, speaking to these young journalists to make sure they understand that the press is not the enemy of the American people. Now, what was lost in the reporting of that was the second part where I addressed these young budding journalists, and I said, but oh, by the way, you have a responsibility too. What I learned in Journalism 101 is you better make sure, first and foremost, you leave your bias at the door. If you are a reporter, I don't care what your position is, your personal political position, you can't bring that into your news reporting. Second, you better make sure your sources are valid, that you've got at least one or two primary sources and a couple of secondary sources, and that you vet them. So that was, of course, lost in the hoopla that followed my comment. But it was important to me to say, yeah, the press isn't the American people, but oh, by the way, make sure you that are reporting the news do so in a way that makes your reporting credible. But this kind of started a series, and frankly, what I tried not to do was to be the person that every time the president said something, I jumped out. That I didn't want to do that. I tried to pick and choose the times when I addressed my concerns. The second one I think had to do with John Brennan, and I've known John Brennan for a very long time, and I don't agree with everything John Brennan says, but what I can tell you is he is a remarkable public servant, a man of incredible integrity and character. And for the president to come out against the former director of the CIA and to assault his credibility, again, I realized in coming forth that I was going to take some criticism. I'm okay with that, but I'm not going to stand by and let a good friend and a public servant be eviscerated by the president. And so each time what I tried to do was to make sure that, frankly, I was living up to what I thought were my oath, which was to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And while I don't want to make this the assumption that, the president wasn't the enemy of the Constitution, but when there were constitutional issues that I thought needed to be addressed, I tried to address them. But to go back to the very beginning of this, I think as a military leader, you have to be cautious about doing this. You have a certain level of expectation among the American public that you'll stay out of politics. I think that is well and good, and I don't begrudge any of my colleagues for not engaging. So I think it becomes a personal choice, and it was just a personal choice I made.
Did you, in the previous administration, in the Trump administration, there was a lot of concern about that blending of the politicization of the U.S. military. One example that got a lot of attention was in June of 2020 with President Trump, and General Milley making the walk across into St. John's Church. In your nearly 4 decades in uniform, did you ever see other times where there was a concern about that politicization of the military, or would you say that it has hit a point now where something needs to be done or needs to change before it gets to it goes beyond a place where it can come back from?
Well, the fact of the matter is, every president since George Washington, I'm sure, has surrounded themselves with the military in order to ensure they have credibility, both with the military and the American people. And I really don't have any problem with that. And in fact, I can tell you, when I was in uniform, we really appreciated the president, all the presidents. And I have no doubt that the young soldiers loved it when President Trump came and talked to them. So I've got no problem at all with the president coming and thanking the military and, frankly, showing their support for the military. The issue with both Mark Milley and Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, getting kind of caught up in this photo op, I will tell you, Mark Milley is one of the finest officers I've ever served with. And what was, I think, incredibly important was right after this event, when he realized he had gotten kind of caught up in it, and he realized it was a mistake, the first thing he did was apologize to the men and women in the military, to say, look, I shouldn't have been put in that position. I shouldn't have been caught in that position. I regret it. The military, we do not swear an allegiance to a particular person, not to the president. Our oath is to the Constitution of the United States. And Chairman Milley made that absolutely clear. And I thought that was just one remarkable, but also a showcase of his character and his integrity to come forward and say, look, this was a mistake. We should never be put in that position. But in terms of presidents using the military, again, a little bit of that has always gone on. A little bit of it, I think, is absolutely fine. But there are times when it's supporting a political agenda, and that's sometimes difficult to define. But that's when I think you got to be very, very careful about it.
You mentioned free speech and First Amendment. It's of course vital to a democracy, and it's something that the men and women in the U.S. military fight to defend for the American people, to preserve that for the American people. One thing that we have also seen is this rising of these First Amendment protests, more and more of them, and the U.S. military, particularly the National Guard, being brought in to support them. Now, while they're generally brought in for traffic control and not, is there a danger in using people, men and women in uniform, being seen in any way as maybe trying to impede those First Amendment protests? Do you worry about how the American people might see that?
Oh, absolutely. And once again, if you recall, after this, both Secretary Esper, Mark Esper, and Mark Milley came forward and said, look, the military, this is not the role of the military. Now, to your point, Courtney, yes, the National Guard can be brought in at the behest of governors, but the mainstream military is, unless posse comitatus is implemented, does not have a role to play in keeping protesters at bay. Now, the fact of the matter is, I've always been in favor of protest, back to the First Amendment. And when I was chancellor, I would have a chance to talk to the student faculty, the student senate, and I would say, look, if you have a problem, protest, march on the streets, but do so thoughtfully, do so civilly, do so lawfully. don't damage property, don't hurt anyone. This is the power of the First Amendment. The problem is when all of a sudden you begin to have people that are breaking glass, that are burning cars, that are doing, well, then it's taken out of the hands of peaceful protest. But once again, you have to be very, very careful about men and women in uniform, in camouflage utilities, with assault vests on, looking like we are a third world country trying to put down, lawful protests. There is, again, I'm a big believer in the right to assemble and the right to protest. But the military needs to keep as far a distance as possible away from those sort of events for the sake of both appearance and reality. We don't want the military suppressing the First Amendment rights.
I have to ask, your name was rumored several times during both the Trump administration and when now President Biden was elected for some kind of a role in the administration. Would you have ever served? Was there any time you would have served as a civilian in the Trump administration?
No.
How about a Biden administration? Would you serve?
Certainly, if asked, I would. But I would offer to you, I'm not. I would always be happy to serve if the administration is right, and if it's something that is within my wheelhouse. I love service. There is nothing, frankly, I think more honorable or more noble than serving your country. I was honored to do it for 37 years as a naval officer. And frankly, I really enjoyed it when I was the chancellor of the University of Texas system. It is a state system. One of the reasons I took that job was because it had a lot of the characteristics of my time in the military. I had an opportunity to oversee 14 institutions with these great presidents that we serviced about 7 million patient visits a year at some of our health institutions, and of course 230,000 students. So serving the students, serving the patients, being part of a great organization like the University of Texas was a lot like being in the military. And while I was always cautious not to call the students my troops, there was this sense of my responsibility as a leader was to take care of my troops, to take care of the faculty, to take care of the students, to take care of the patients, and that is service, and I think just as honorable, just as noble as any service in the federal government or in uniform.
One thing you've done since you left uniform as well is writing. You wrote a book. You've written quite a bit about leadership, actually, including in your book, Make Your Bed. What are some qualities that you find make an effective leader?
Yeah, in the military, we always talk about servant leadership. And the expectation is, as a leader, you need to understand it's not about you. If it ever becomes about you, you're probably not the right person to be the leader. It really has to be about the team and the mission. Your job is to ensure that the members of your team, have the guidance, have the resources, have the latitude to do the job, and you empower them, you enable them, you inspire them, you manage them, you facilitate them, you do whatever it takes to get the job done. But it's not about your ego, it's not about your success. But I learned early on in the Navy, probably one of the best lessons I ever had in leadership was actually when I was a midshipman at the University of Texas. In between your freshman and sophomore year, the Navy euphemistically sends you on what they call a cruise. Not exactly, the cruise to the Caribbean, but in this case, I went to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and I was stationed on board a fast frigate, which is a pointy nose destroyer-like ship. And here you are, a prospective officer, and the Navy says, that's great, you're going to be an officer, but you know what you're going to do for the next 9 weeks? You're going to be an enlisted man. And we didn't have women on ships at the time. And so you berth with the sailors. You spend all day with the sailors, you're chipping paint, you're scrubbing the decks, you're buffing the floors, you're working in the boiler room, you're cleaning the heads. And what you learn in that 9 weeks is that the decisions of the officers have a direct impact on the sailors at the deck plate level. And so as you go through the rest of your life, you have this understanding that, look, if you're a leader, you damn well better understand the implications of your decisions. You have to understand how that affects the rank and file that work for you. And I always thought that was just a remarkable opportunity on the part of the Navy and a remarkable lesson learned that was really terrific for me.
That is, I've never heard that. I mean, going to Hawaii for that cruise actually isn't the worst thing, but
Hawaii wasn't so bad.
President Biden has recently announced that his decision to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and that came apparently against the advice of his military leaders, according to much of the reporting out there. I mean, this is how the system works, right? The civilians make the decision, they make the policy decisions, and the military, they carry them out, they implement them, they provide their best advice, but the civilians ultimately make the decision. Should President Biden, you spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, you know the conflict well, should he have heeded his military advisors' advice on that? I mean, both for the sake of Afghanistan, what's going on the ground there, and then potentially also for the relationship between the civil-military relationship.
Yeah, well, let me answer the last question first. It is not going to hurt the relationship between the president and the military one bit. And here's why. As you mentioned, the leaders, certainly those that have a direct effect on Afghanistan. So General Scott Miller, who is the ISAF commander, General Frank McKenzie, who is the CENTCOM commander, and of course, General Mark Milley, the chairman, and Secretary Lloyd Austin. All four men have extensive experience in Afghanistan. In fact, I think Scott Miller has probably spent more time in Afghanistan than any single officer I know. All they wanted to do was to make certain that their concerns were listened to by the president, and that the president understood the risks. And there are risks out there. I mean, there are risks of a resurgent Taliban. There are risks of Al-Qaeda coming back in and having sanctuary in Afghanistan. There are risks to all the progress that the women have made. All of those are risks. But to your point, Courtney, at the end of the day, when the president makes a decision and listens to the leaders and says, gentlemen, I appreciate your input, but I think we need to move in another direction, then we're a professional military. The answer after that is, sir, we got it. Now we're going to carry out your orders, and we're going to do everything we can to mitigate the risk. We're going to extract the soldiers in a thoughtful and timely manner. We're going to do what you need us to do because you have taken the opportunity to hear our concerns, and now we will salute smartly and move out.
Are there any times when you were in uniform that you can give us an example of where you provided your best military leadership and the civilians made a counter decision, and whether that was they actually may have made, you realized in retrospect that they made the correct decision?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, I mean, we in the military don't know everything, and it's, it is great to be able to give your advice, but your advice is niche when it comes to, we're talking about the tactical and the operational advice of a commander on the battlefield. But of course, the president or Congress or others, they're looking at the big picture. They're looking at, the broader strategic relationships. They're looking at the impact on domestic decisions. They're looking at a lot of things that sometimes we in the military don't. I would offer one of the best things that ever happened to the military was the establishment of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, or was the enactment of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1987, which really changed everything about the way the military was structured. And without going into a great deal of detail, it really kind of put the operational power in the hands of the combatant commanders. And it changed the organization. Everybody now had to be joint. Well, let me tell you, the military, because I was in the Pentagon at the time, the military fought this decision tooth and nail. It was probably the single best decision ever made in terms of how the military was structured and how we became the world's finest military. And there's nobody even in second place, close second, because of the restructuring from the Goldwater-Nichols Act. So, and I was a young lieutenant in the Pentagon, maybe lieutenant commander at the time. And again, I was on the other side. We were fighting from the Navy side. We think this is a bad idea. And of course, we were wrong. Congress had it right. And then as I go through my career, and certainly when I was in command, there were a lot of times, particularly as a senior officer, where I saw opportunities, tactical opportunities, maybe even operational or things that I thought had strategic impact. And the president's or the Secretary of Defense said, thanks very much, Bill, but we're not going to do that. And once again, you'd like to think they always take your advice, and I'm appreciative of the fact that they took my advice most of the time. but not all the time. And that's okay. That's okay as long as you have an opportunity to be heard.
You know, another thing that you write about in your newest book, in the Hero Code, is about John McCain. And of course, that's who, you know, we're all here for this forum because of this legacy that Senator McCain, the late Senator McCain, established over years, both in his service in the military and then, of course, his longtime service in the United States Senate. But you have a chapter entitled Duty. And that's where you write about Senator McCain. And there was, of course, you talk about his sacrifice during Vietnam, his terrible sacrifice, tremendous sacrifice. But you also tell a story about meeting him when you were coming up for a confirmation. And I was struck by what surprised you by that meeting. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I was getting ready to go before my confirmation hearings for 4-star to be the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. And as always, you go by and you meet the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And so I go up into the Capitol Hill and I'm going in to see Senator McCain. And of course, you know, as both a naval officer and an American, you know, I of course knew John McCain's background, and it is legendary. I mean, his decision when in a POW camp, after being brutalized for years, he had the opportunity to leave. The North Vietnamese were going to let him go primarily as a propaganda ploy because his father was a 4-star admiral, and they thought, we're going to show that, you know, if your daddy's important, you get preferential treatment. And so they were going to use him as a propaganda tool. And McCain, you know, following the military code of conduct, which says, you know, I won't take favors from my captors, refused to leave. I can't imagine. I'm not sure I would have been strong enough to do that. I mean, it's just a remarkable act of courage and duty. But as I go in to see him, so, you know, all that is swirling around in my head as I go in to meet the senator. And he comes out of his office and he's got a big grin on his face. And of course, this is after the bin Laden raid. You know, he shakes my hand. We come in, we start talking. And again, he kind of wants to talk about me and the things I've been doing. But we kind of trade Navy stories. But at the end of it, he says to me, he says, I really want to thank you for everything you've done. I want to thank you for your service. I mean, I was like, you want to thank me? I want to thank you. And just this act of graciousness and humility to be thanking me, because my service has paled in comparison to what John McCain did. It was just, for me, it was a remarkable moment that I'll never forget.
There's another story in that same chapter about duty that I also found really interesting. And it's a story about a young airman in Afghanistan who actually defied you and would not listen to you, the 3-star admiral at the time in Afghanistan. But you wrote about how she exemplified duty in doing so. Can you share that story with us as well?
Yeah, it was President Obama had made a trip to Afghanistan, and Air Force One had flown into Bagram Air Base, which is where my task force was located. And he was going to get on a couple of helicopters and fly into Kabul to meet with President Karzai, but the weather was bad. So now all of a sudden he's trapped in Bagram. I'm actually in the gym working out, and my aide comes running in. The general who was in charge of President Obama's visit had called up and said, look, I want to get McRaven over here, you know, right now to brief the president. I'm trying to find things to do. And so, you know, I rush out of the gym. I throw on my uniform, and I've been told I have 20 minutes before I'm scheduled to brief the president. Well, by the time I get dressed and get my convoy and everything, you know, it's less than 10 minutes left. But I'm thinking it's okay. I mean, it's a short drive from where my forces were located. I had to go across the main street and then to the airfield. And then the president was in a hangar in the airfield. So, you know, we get across the street, we get to the back gate, got about 5 minutes left. But I'm thinking, I mean, it takes me, you know, a minute to get to the hangar, no problem. Well, as we get there, the sergeant hops out of the vehicle, and there's a young female guard at the gate. And I'm looking out, and I can see him. He kind of walks up, and he's a big, tall fella, and he's kind of, you know, cowering over her a little bit. And I can't hear what's happening, but, you know, it's kind of a casual conversation. Then all of a sudden, you know, arms are flailing, watches are being tapped, storming back, roll down the window, and he goes, sir, she's not going to let us through. We're not on the approved list. And of course, we weren't on the approved list because we had just gotten this last minute notification. So my sergeant major, the senior enlisted guy in the car, says, "Sorry, don't worry about it. I got this." So he gets out and he goes up, and I'm peering through the back window again, looking again, and same thing, kind of calm before long. Arms are moving, watches are being tapped, and he storms back and he shakes his head and he says, "She's not going to let us through." And I thought, okay, boys, yeah, I'm the admiral here. I got this. So I get out of the car and I go up to the young airman. And I said, I looked at her name tag, a real person. Her real name was not Jackson. But I looked at the airman. I said, Airman Jackson, you can see I'm not a bad guy. I'm Admiral McRaven. I've got a briefing with the president like right now. So we really need to get through. And she kind of steels herself. She says, "Sir, I understand that, but you're not on my list. And, I've got a job to do. And until the sergeant clears you, I can't let you through." I took a deep breath. I said, "Okay, got it. Let me know when we're clear." So I go back to the car. Well, about 10 minutes later, finally the gate lifts up and away we go through. I briefed the president. He never even asked why I'm late. But as I'm coming back through, I stop the convoy and I get out of the car and I go back up to the airman. And I've got this scowl on my face. And I said, "Airman, do you realize that I was 10 minutes late to brief the president of the United States?" And she was eyes kind of cast down. She goes, "Yes, sir." I said, "You wouldn't let us through when my sergeant asked you. You wouldn't let us through when the sergeant major asked you. And you wouldn't let us through when I asked you. And I'm a 3-star admiral." And she said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a command challenge coin, which, as you know, Courtney, are only given to soldiers who do exceptional work. I put it in her hand and I said, "You did exactly the right thing. You can come work for me anytime." And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Sir, I was just doing my duty." And the point of the story, of course, was not that she was just blindly following orders. She had a responsibility. She had a responsibility to protect her gate. There was a sergeant that had a responsibility over her, and a major that was responsible for the sergeants, and a colonel that was responsible for the majors, and a general that was responsible for all of it. And at the end of the day, doing your duty is never about you. It's about the people around you. And I don't care whether you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, whether you're guarding your gate, or whether you're John McCain, standing up to the North Vietnamese. This is what makes these qualities, these noble qualities, so great, is it's never about the person. If you do your duty right, it's about taking care of other people. It's about serving other people. And that is what John McCain did, and that's what this young airman did.
And there are stories, your newest book, The Hero Code, is just full of such fascinating stories like that of your time in uniform. I really enjoyed it. And I have really genuinely enjoyed our time here today. Admiral McRaven, I cannot thank you enough for making the time to speak to the McCain Institute, the Sedona Forum. And I really, really, really hope that we all see each other in person in Sedona next year. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you very much, Courtney. This was fun.